So, you've heard this word vermicomposting, and now you're wondering what it is, how to do it, why you should do it, and how to get started. So, let's talk about it. If you're new here, my name is Alyssia. I am a worm farmer and environmentalist, and it's my mission to teach people how to vermicompost in a very practical and easy to do way. If you're not so new here, welcome back. I'm happy to see you. I've missed you. Most of this information, if you're somebody who's not new here or new to vermicomposting, most of this information you will know. No matter how new you are or not to vermicomposting, feel free to use the chapters along this video to kind of skip around and find the information that you need for where you are in your journey, okay? Feel free to grab a paper, a pen, and some water. Coffee or tea is fine, whatever suits you. And let's talk about vermicomposting. Breaking down the word vermicomposting, vermi means worm, and composting is the natural process of decomposition of organic matter. For the purposes of this video, organic matter or organic material, when you hear me say that, I'm just referring to anything that once had life. So you and I are organic material. Our animals are organic material. The plants that grow our food, our house plants, organic material. The trees outside, water. That's right. It's all organic material. And so that is what I'm referring to in this video when I say organic matter, not necessarily like growing food organically, unless I say that specifically. So when we look at vermicomposting, it is the process of using worms to break down organic material. And what happens at the end of that process is you have a nutrient dense material that has nutrients, but it also has a lot of microbiology. It is biologically diverse. And when you take that material and put it out into, let's say, your garden or around your trees, it is going to give that environment, your soil, the living beings that it needs to break down and process the other organic materials. And it's going to help to create a soil that is ideal for growing healthy, whole, nutrient dense foods. So that is what vermicomposting is. And that is one of the benefits. It helps us to grow foods that are energetically beneficial to the human body and also to the soil, because we don't eat all of our food, right? Sometimes that food just goes to the trash, to the landfill. But instead of doing that, we can take our foods and use worms to break it down. For this process, you are going to need worms, of course, and something to house them in. I personally use bins or just buckets for my worm farm. You might have space outside where you have a designated garden bed or something like that for your worms. They can go directly into your garden beds as well. So you really just need the worms and a space to house your worms. When we talk about worms and what worms will be best for your journey, it really just depends on where you live and your environment, because you don't want to live somewhere like Colorado and have European night crawlers that love the heat. It gets cold in Colorado. Your worms are not going to survive, or they're going to be very unhappy and they won't thrive. So the first step in your research is to decide where you're going to put your worms. I should also stop there and say vermicomposting is a beautiful, beautiful way to divert waste if you live in a small home or an apartment. Apartment dwellers love vermicomposting. It takes up much less space than people typically think. And so we'll get more into it. But yes, if you live in an apartment, you can also vermicompost. So just figure out where you're going to put your worms. You just want it to be like a cool, dark space where they'll be predominantly unbothered, okay? From there, you're going to want to decide what type of worms you are going to utilize for the process of vermicomposting. I typically suggest to most people to use red wigglers because they are true composting worms. Red wigglers are Eisenia fetida, which you typically have to purchase online. Yes, we sell red wigglers at pgwormfarm.com. When the creator created these little tiny worms, he was like, y'all are going down to earth, and your job is to compost dead material. And so, because of this, red wigglers don't need a whole lot of space. They need about 6 inches of bedding in their bin and just the organic material to keep them fed and moisture, not wet, just moist. And they're going to thrive. They're also highly prolific, which means they reproduce at a high rate, as long as their conditions are ideal for them to thrive. Then I also suggest European night crawlers, Icenia hortensis, because you can find European night crawlers more readily available. You can just go to Walmart in the sporting goods section and grab European night crawlers versus red wigglers. You typically have to order online, but they do have them at PetSmart in small quantities. So those are the worm types that I typically suggest. But of course, do your research. Make sure those worms, you have the space for them if you're going to be using European night crawlers. Or if you live somewhere that's hotter, African night crawlers. There's about 7 varieties of worms that you can use to vermicompost with here in North America. And so you'll just want to do your research and figure out which species of worm is going to work best for you. Like I said, red wigglers are very hardy. They do well in temperature fluctuations and just different environments in general. So I typically suggest those. When you're ready to purchase your worms, you can head over to pgwormfarm.com and we got you. So let's talk a little bit about the benefits of vermicomposting and why you should do it. So the initial, obvious benefit of vermicomposting is that you are diverting waste, organic waste, from the landfills. When organic material is improperly disposed and doesn't have the right oxygen flow and things like that, it tends to build up very toxic greenhouse gases that go off into our atmosphere and create even more greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, which is causing us to fry. It's hot in the summer. We know that. We have officially met the 1.5 degrees that scientists didn't want us to reach, but we're there now. And so I'm so happy that you all are here to learn more about vermicomposting, because the more of us that are diverting our waste from the landfill, the less emissions that we are producing. And that is going to help to benefit the environment, because we're not putting even more greenhouse gases into an already toxic atmosphere, right? So that is the obvious benefit of vermicomposting. It's also going to give you, like we talked about, that nutrient dense material, that biologically diverse material that's going to help you to grow healthy, whole foods for your family and your community. I know a lot of people are looking at our food systems and they're like, I have to eat poison because my government says so. No, thanks. And so a lot of us are starting to look into gardening for ourselves, or support local farmers, things like that. If you are someone that is vermicomposting but you don't grow your own food, but you would like to eat food that is more closely sourced from a neighbor, a community garden, a local farmer, the worm castings that you produce in your bin can be given to these people that are growing the food, and they're going to put it into that soil, and it's going to benefit the soil so much. Vermicomposting helps to build soil structure. It helps our plants to be more resistant to climate change and just pests and disease and all these things. Helps our soil to be drought resistant. And there's just so many beautiful benefits of vermicast in soil growing food. So that is another benefit, along with what I have found to be spiritual benefits. Before I started vermicomposting, I was depressed and was battling anxiety, and just mentally, your girl was not in a good space, okay? And once I started really caring and nurturing these little tiny worm beings, it helped me to snap out of whatever I had going on in my head, whatever I was over processing, overthinking, overstimulated by. I really felt like when I got these worms, I felt like I had a responsibility to care for them in a way that was unselfish, right? And so I began to go outside. No matter how I was feeling in my depression and my anxiety, I would at least step outside, put my feet in the grass, catch some sunlight on my skin, and that energy was brought back to my worms. And there's just so many things that I have learned through my worm bin in a spiritual sense, which we'll talk about more in the future. But there's so many benefits to vermicomposting that I would spend hours explaining to you all what they are. So we'll get into it later. But for now, just know that vermicomposting is a beautiful, beautiful art and science. And I am excited that you are here to learn more about it. So we already kind of talked a little bit about what you need to get started on your vermicomposting journey. Step one is to do your research. I know that when you think about worms, you just think about worms, like they're just worms. So it's not like a huge responsibility if you choose to start vermicomposting. But I feel like if we are going to get into this lifestyle, it is important for us to do our research and understand exactly who these little tiny beings are, what they're going to need from us, what they require, and how we can really show up in a way that is truly beneficial for them. Because at the end of the day, I hate to say it, but we're placing them into captivity, right? And so we want to make sure that their conditions are ideal as possible. It's just like if you're going to adopt a dog, a cat, a horse, a pig, however that goes for your journey, you're not just going to jump in and go adopt. You're going to do research on the breed. You're going to learn more. You're going to figure things out, everything that you need in order to get started. So make sure you do your research first. So from there, you're going to figure out where you want to put your bin, what kind of bin you're going to use, and all of these things. And then you're going to decide what breed, what species of worm you want to use on your composting journey. And like I said, you just want to make sure that that breed, that species of worm, is ideal for your environment outside, especially if you're going to keep them outside. Now, if you're keeping them inside your home and you have ways to control their environment a little bit more, you don't have to worry so much about the breed specifics. Well, you do, because you need to know how to keep them inside the house, but do your research, okay? Things that you're also going to need. So you'll need your worms, you'll need your bin or your garden bed, wherever you're going to keep them. You'll need your bedding type, and you'll need to know how you're going to keep them moist. I typically suggest using a spray bottle. Do not just dump water in your bin, especially when you're just starting out, because moisture is the killer of many bins, okay? Too much moisture in a bin can be catastrophic to your worm clue and your vermicomposting journey. I highly emphasize research and starting off slow and things like that, because as someone who is a consultant of vermicomposting, who teaches vermicomposting, I see people make common mistakes all the time, which we'll talk about in a little bit, and it deters them from continuing their journey, which I don't want that for you. I want you to be successful on this journey. So make sure you're researching, make sure that you have everything you need to get started, which isn't a lot, but make sure that you have it all set up and in place so that when your worms arrive, you are ready to go. You can start freezing your kitchen scraps and get your bin set up, order your worms, and by the time your worms get to you, your bin is inoculated and everything's kind of like marinated and ready and perfect for your worms, okay? So let's talk a little bit about the types of bedding that you can use. You can use leaves, especially if you're going to be outside vermicomposting. I definitely suggest leaves. If you're going to be inside, you want to be a little bit mindful, because leaves can bring in pests and things like that you don't really want in your home. But leaves are a good source of carbon. Bedding is carbon. You can also use shredded brown paper bags. Some people use newspaper, cardboard. You're going to be inside. I typically just suggest using shredded up brown paper bag, which is what I use. You can use coco coir. Some people will say peat moss, but it is not a sustainable source of bedding. it's not a renewable source. So once all the peat moss in the world is gone because we've used it all in our garden beds or in our worm bins, it's gone. Coco coir is a great source for bedding. So shredded brown paper bag, coco coir, carbon. Those were all carbon. And so is your cardboard, which are great sources for bedding. Leaves you can add as well. Like I said, you just want to be mindful. But if you're vermicomposting outdoors, yes to the leaves. All the leaves. We love leaves. It's the best source of bedding for your worms, truly. So, like I said, depending on what species of worm you're going to use, I always encourage people to check your community before you go and purchase your worms, just because they're going to be acclimated to whatever conditions your state, city, town, whatever has, right? They're going to be already immersed in that environment, and so they'll do better versus ordering out, which, like I said, it can be hard to find red wigglers like locally sourced. So head over to pgwormfarm.com and you can order your red wigglers on our site. We have them available year round now. Shout out to everybody that's been supporting us. You are part of this beautiful cultivation that is happening here at Princess Gardens. But yeah, you can order red wigglers from us. Sometimes we have European night crawlers, but not always. So yes, know where you're going to get your worms from. So let's chat a little bit about what you can compost with your worms. The worms typically will eat any organic matter. So that is fruits and veggies, your grains, your oats, your all the things, leaves, anything that once had life. There are some don'ts though. We do not want to put meat into our bins, especially if you're inside. Listen, don't y'all come for me, because I know there are people that are in the community that are like, you can compost meat, you can compost spicy things, you can compost all these different things. I know you can. It's organic matter, so eventually it will get consumed, if not by your worms, by the microbiology in the bin. But when you are vermicomposting inside and you add meat and eggs and yogurt and these things into your bin, it can create funk. And I don't know about y'all, I don't want funk. Sorry, I hit the mic. I don't want funk in my home. So to each his own. Anything that once had life can essentially go into your bin, right? It can. But there are some things that are going to take longer to break down, and it's going to create things in your bin that you may not want to experience necessarily. So I typically say no meat, no dairy, no eggs. Eggshells are fine. You're going to powder those and sprinkle it over your feedings, and that's going to offer a great source of grit because your worms need that in order to efficiently process through organic matter. But spicy things, they also don't care too much for spicy things. There are also some things about pineapple because it has an enzyme in it that consumes protein, but from research and things like that, pineapple is typically okay. Just do it in small amounts. There are things that you can and cannot feed your worms, essentially. We won't get deep into it in this video, but just make sure you do a little bit of research. I do have a resource over on pgwormfarm.com, printable menu, essentially, of what you can and can't feed your worms, or what you should and shouldn't feed your worms, because essentially, if it is organic material, it once had life, they can and will consume it, right? But there are some things like grains and oats and things like that that might create issues in the bin if you overdo it. So make sure you do your research on that. I'll also do a full length video on that type of stuff at a later date. But you can also head over to pgwormfarm.com and purchase the resource so that you are mindful of what and how you're feeding your worms, okay? Let's talk a little bit about how to set up your worm bin. It's super simple. There are like tower thingies that you can purchase online. You can purchase worm bins online. If you have the resources to do that, by all means, please do. But if you're someone who likes to save some money, yeah, and you like to make your own bins, you literally can go to Walmart hardware store, grab yourself a 5-gallon bucket, and drill holes in the sides, like up around the rim and the top of the bin, and you have your perfect worm bin. A couple holes on the bottoms for drainage if things are overly moist. But it's super simple. Your worms are going to be happy and they're going to thrive in a simple setup. I will make a video. I might already have a video on here showing you how I make my bins, but I will make another video showing you all how I create my worm bins, and then you can go from there and get started on creating your worm bin as well. Let's talk now about some common questions that I get, like how do I feed my worms? It's pretty simple. So you can do like I do, which is called horizontal feeding. I just dig a hole in my bin and put my kitchen scraps in there, sprinkle it with eggshell powder, cover it up, mark it so that I know where I fed, and I work my way along my bin, feeding them. And then there another way to do it is called like layer feeding. So you can drop your kitchen scraps in and then add carbon. You always want to add fresh carbon bedding into your feedings because there is microbiology within the bin that needs that fresh carbon in order to survive. And so each feeding, no matter if you do horizontally or you do layered, you're always going to want to add some fresh carbon in there. So with our second option, you just put your kitchen scraps in. The smaller the better. Frozen is always good. Put your kitchen scraps in, take some nice moist, not wet, bedding and cover up at least 2 inches over that feeding. And those are the two most common ways that you'll see people feeding their worms. It's super simple. Yeah, and your worms are going to love you. What if the bin smells? That's also a question that I get often. If your bin is stinky, there can be a couple things that are going on. Typically, if you are smelling funk in your bin is probably too moist or you're not covering your kitchen scraps up enough. So you always want to have 2 inches of bedding in your bin covering your kitchen scraps. That way you don't smell things. Other pests and vermin and things like that don't smell the kitchen scraps and start trying to come into your bin. It'll keep gnats and things like the fruit flies, things like that away because they can't smell it, so they don't know where to go to get it. Also, if your bin is too moist, things will be funky. Sometimes you will get like a sulfury egg fart smell in your bin. You don't want that. So just make sure your bedding is moist, like a wrung out sponge, but not wet. Like there should be, if you take some bedding and you squeeze it and it's like dripping, it's way too wet. Like 1 to 2 little drops coming off of your bedding is fine, but if you have more than that, you're going to want to add in some fresh, dry, or very, very lightly moistened bedding, okay? And you guys can always reach out to me and ask questions. I'm on Instagram, here on YouTube in the comments. You can leave those questions that you have and I'm happy to answer them, okay? Another question that I get all the time is how to keep pests away. And typically, one thing that we have to talk about is pests themselves. What you will find is your bin will have things like springtails and mites and things like that. Those are considered pests, but they are also decomposers, which are necessary for the process of decomposition. They're going to help your worms out, and as long as they're not there in like massive amounts, you're good. When you start having things like rodents and roaches and ew coming in, it means that you're not covering your kitchen scraps up enough. So that's the best way to deter pests, is just by covering your kitchen scraps up with at least 2 inches of bedding, using your top to keep things like that out, and you'll be good. Last common question that I get is, how do we know when our compost is ready? So typically your vermicomposting system is going to take 3 months to process and things like that. Every 3 months, you can go in for a harvest. I will also say vermicast is readily usable. So it's not like your typical like hot compost if you have a pile of compost and you have to wait for it to cool, things like that. Not with vermicompost. If you want to go and add some vermicast to like your seed starting mix, you can go in, grab a handful of vermicast and sprinkle it in your seed starting mix. And if you get some worms in that, you just put them back in the bin and go on about your business. But every 3 months or so, depending on how you run your bin, is when you're going to go in and want to harvest your bins. And that brings us to harvesting our vermicast, harvesting our vermicomposting system, which is a beautiful, beautiful process. You will feel so fulfilled and like you just achieved the most amazing thing, because you have this very dark, rich, earthy smelling material. It looks different from the bedding that you initially put in there. And so that's how you really know that it's ready. It's just really dark and rich black, and it smells like like when it rains is what vermicast that is ready smells like. So in order to harvest your castings, you can either harvest by hand, which is typically what I do. You just put your vermicompost in a pile and lightly start to like brush off the layers. It's a process and it takes some time. But in my opinion, it's better for the worms because they're not being jostled around and microbes aren't losing tentacles and arms and shit when you're sifting them in a sifter. And that brings us to our second method. You can use like a sifter or some type of contraption to sift out your worm castings and separate your worms from the vermicast. So those are the two most common methods for harvesting. After you've harvested, you just take your worms and restart that process all over again. So you do want to make sure you have a new bed set up before you go to harvest. Have that bed set up. Take some of those ready castings, worm poop, and put it in the new bin. Mix it in a little bit, and then once you harvest, you can take your worms and just put them into their new bin. And then use your vermicast, your worm castings for whatever you're going to use it for. What can you use vermicompost for? You can use it for many things. You can use it in your garden just by mixing it into the soil, the vermicompost, the worm castings, the worm poop itself, taking that and mixing it into your soil. Gently just massage it in there and then water it in so that the microbial life and the nutrients can move down into the garden bed soil. Another way that you can use it is you can make compost tea, which is basically extracting the nutrients and the biodiversity out of the material, the matter, and putting it into the water. And then you can, hey kitty, my cat is coming to say hi. And then you can just use the compost tea to water your garden. And then don't throw away. Don't throw away the compost, the vermicast, the material, the brown, rich material that you used for the extraction, because you can take that material and just mix it into your soil. And that compost tea is just going to have that nutrients more readily available. And because it's in liquid form, it's going to hit that root system quicker and all the things. You can also use your vermicast to create a foliar spray. And for me, that process just looks the same as creating the compost tea. I go through that same process and just use it to spray on my plants versus putting it down into the soil, which there are lots of benefits on. And we'll talk about that at a later date. So let's talk a little bit about troubleshooting your bin, because as a beginner, you're bound to run into issues because you're learning something new. When this happens, I want for you guys to remember, whenever there's an issue, just add browns. Carbon is literally, typically, the resolution to your issue. If your bin is too wet, add carbon. If your bin is too dry, spray some moisture. If it's like super dry, it's okay to like really hit it with the water and mix it up. But overall, you want to spray it down. If your worms are trying to escape, there's typically an issue. Either there's overcrowding, which means you're doing a fantastic job and your worms need more space, so you're going to want to separate your worm clue into another bin. Also, them trying to escape can just be because, hey, we're in a new environment. I don't know what's going on in this joint, so let's get out of here, guys. That's the thing. When you start your worm bin, you want to try to keep a light over your bin to help them settle into their new space. Things can be too acidic, and if that's the case, there will be some other signs like potworms and all these things. We'll talk about it later, but there's a few reasons why your worms will try to escape. But the main one, especially if you're just starting out, is typically because they're in a new environment and they're trying to explore. Worms are animals, y'all, so they want to explore and see what's going on. They're going to follow moisture, things like that, so they may try to escape. Also, I have found that when people are just starting out, they don't have enough oxygen holes. So drill that thing up, okay? Make sure that you have enough oxygen inside your bin so that your worms are not suffocating, okay? If anything stinks, add browns. Typically, if you're adding too much food waste, that is going to cause some stench in your bin, and you don't want that. So feed light. See how quickly your worms are processing through. You feed and you're like, okay, let me go feed my worms again. You can feed as often as you like to, but if you feed and you go back and there's still food there and it's not like looking like it's being worked through, do not feed again until you go back and that food is like almost completely gone. And that is the rule of thumb that I tell people when they're just starting out. So that they don't overfeed their bin, because that will create so many problems. So many. Don't overfeed. Make sure that your bin is moist but not wet, okay? I think that's all I have as far as like vermicomposting and telling you what it is and all the things. If this was helpful, hit that thumbs up button and make sure you subscribe, because I do plan on doing weekly videos to kind of walk you through the process, help you along your journey, no matter where you are in your journey. You can check out older videos that show me feeding on my worm farm and things like that. Yeah, so let me know down in the comments how you guys are feeling. Are you feeling more confident about your vermicomposting journey if you've already gotten started? If you're just hearing about vermicomposting, are you intrigued? Are you ready to get started? Are you ready to do your research and then get started? Let me know down in the comments how you guys are feeling about this. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments. And of course, you guys can always check out my website, pgwormfarm.com. I have lots of resources and information over there. If you have little ones, I've written a book called Willow Worm's Big Day, which basically just goes through the process, teaching little ones and adults the process of vermicomposting and what's happening inside your worm bin, just to, educate everyone on the process of vermicomposting. So let me know what you think down in the comments. Ask your questions. Say hey if you don't have any questions. However that goes for you. I want to hear from you down in the comments. And subscribe and like and all the things so that YouTube pushes these videos out so that we can get more people out here saving the planet, okay? Saving ourselves, because truly, vermicomposting has changed my life in such a beneficial way. So I'll tell my story in full one of these days. But for now, I look forward to building and growing with you all in community. Peace.